Are you all safe, dear listeners? On the outskirt of Seoul, today is August 17th, 2035. 5 years had already passed since August 17th, 2030, the day that became a catastrophe for all of humanity. Huge, terrible monsters roamed the streets of the city, roaring in search of prey. Such unidentified monsters began to flow out of perversions that arose all over the world precisely on that day. The speaker assumed that since then, they had sunk to nothing more than game for one meal. But his interlocutor was surprised when he heard such words as the awakened, who tried day and night, would have their hearts pierced by such words. The narrator was surprised that his interlocutor thought so and asked, "Whose merit, then, is it that as many as 40% of humanity still survives?" The MC suddenly looked up from the recording and jerked his head to the side. The voice in his earpiece admitted that he thought it was all thanks to the walls built from reinforced alloys. The protagonist raised himself up, looking over the stone ledge he was hiding behind, and froze in surprise. The man from the recording called his interlocutor shameless, and in the end, they came to the conclusion that the barriers have their limits, because you just need to look around. Overcrowding in safe zones leads to a shortage of basic supplies. The protagonist frowned, noticing the large number of monsters passing by. He counted that there were 6 monsters above Class C and 1 monster of Class A. Everything was as Gilles said, and he took out his binoculars to take a closer look at the creatures passing by. Then he looked at the empty space that the monsters were approaching and realized that this meant that the heat was coming soon. Suddenly, a cloud of energy began to concentrate in the empty square, illuminating everything around with a bright flash. This light became brighter and brighter, and the protagonist, who put the binoculars to his eyes again, realized that this was the so-called sudden gate. The energy gradually became more like an elongated portal, and the protagonist was convinced that this was indeed a gate. He also knew about the person who would appear from it, and as soon as he said this, Park Kong-ho jumped out of the bright flash of light. He simply stood in place for a while and then shouted in amazement that he was here. He was glad that he was finally able to return, but his joy quickly turned to horror as he noticed monsters approaching him. He cursed, not understanding what kind of nonsense this was, and asked why these monsters were still here. Junhyuk, meanwhile, sighed in delight, assuming that this was really happening. One of the monsters at that moment raised its paw to attack Kung-ho, and Junhyuk noticed that it was finally starting and smiled happily. Sometime later, as the monsters were making increasingly eerie cries, Kong-ho, covered in blood, froze, breathing heavily. MC understood that in order to face one monster above Class C, it would take a lot of effort. Meanwhile, Kong-ho frowned in concentration, shouting the sword nest spell, and a large number of energy clots resembling swords in shape appeared in the air above him. In order to fight such monsters, at least 10 high-ranking hunters were needed. But Kong-ho was here alone, and he pointed these swords towards the monsters, clenching his jaws from the effort to not lose concentration. When he fully formed the spell, he released the swords at high speed towards the monsters, and the body of one of them was caught in this attack. Kong-ho managed to cut down 6 high-level monsters in just an hour, and he did it all by himself. Another monster he killed fell to the ground in front of him, and he paused to recover a bit. Now he only had 1 A-class monster left, but even if all 5 S-class hunters in the world gathered together, such a task would be impossible. However, despite such a depressing situation, the protagonist smiled enthusiastically as he continued to watch the unfolding battle. Although he had heard about it, he was now surprised at the true power of the Spear Master. Meanwhile, the monster began to concentrate its own magic attack to attack Kong-ho, and the protagonist decided to wait a little longer since he knew what would happen next. Meanwhile, Kung-ho cursed when he noticed the attack formed by the monster, and the protagonist mentally exclaimed that soon this power would belong to him. Meanwhile, the attack flew towards Kung-ho as a powerful beam, but he managed to rise into the air in time with his own skill. He activated Phantom Throw, rushing towards the monster, and then used the Demon Blade, making a large number of cuts. It managed to make a fairly large hole through the body of this monster. The monster fell to the ground, and Junhyuk exclaimed that it was a crazy battle beyond comprehension. He realized that it was time for him to go now and looked at Kong Ho, who fell to the ground, exhausted. One of his arms was missing, and he could not even move. The protagonist soon came down to him and thought that everything was still going, as Jekyll said. He carefully knelt down next to Kong Ho, put his palm on his back, called out to him, and asked about his condition. He remembered that Jekyll had clearly said that he had obtained Kong Ho's power by trying to save him, which meant that if MC helped him, he himself would obtain this power. Kong Ho blushed, spitting out blood, and the protagonist frowned, asking himself how he could save him. He realized that he needed to ask more details. And at that time, Kong Ho opened his eyes slightly and asked what year it was. The protagonist answered that it was August 2035, and Kong Ho sat up, then cursed because the difference was only 5 years, but he spent 30 years in another place, and here only 5 years passed. MC called out to him, advising him not to try to make unnecessary movements, but to just lie down. But Kong Ho knew that it was too late, and Junhyuk thought that he knew it and admitted to himself that he was sorry. But still, Kong Ho was going to die today. Kong Ho sadly lowered his head, cursing because he knew that if he had not spent most of his strength on opening the gate, then everything would have been different. He laughed sadly, and the protagonist looked at him with regret, but said nothing. Kong Ho, meanwhile, pulled out a photo, turning towards the protagonist, and confessed that he had a favor to ask of him. He asked him to find his family and take care of them if they were alive. MC asked in confusion and tried to refuse since it was a little difficult since he himself was not in a position to take care of someone. Kong Ho cried out in pain, but overcame himself and explained that he was not asking the protagonist for free, promising that he would give him the power. MC asked in amazement, but in his mind, he cried out happily since he understood that everything was going according to plan. Kong Ho, meanwhile, added that in order to give the power, he needed the protagonist's name. In this world, which was beaten by catastrophes similar to the apocalypse, there were always two common themes in the life of the protagonist. Before thinking about it, he froze but did not answer. Kong Ho, who meanwhile said his name, asked the protagonist, "What is his name?" In the past, when Junhyuk was older, he was leaning against the shelf and sadly lowered his head. Jonathan Curtis, laughing, was glad that they finally met. It happened in June 2008 in Junhyuk's hideout. He did not answer Jonathan, but thought that the property of irreversibility was applied, and life still goes on. Jonathan ordered him not to even try to dodge like a slimy eel and called him a villain. MC ignored him again and frowned, looking at the wound on his side from which blood was flowing. He knew that he would not be able to escape this time, and asked Jonathan, who told him and his comrades that he was here. Jonathan replied that it was the 16th ranked villain, Cha Jin-soo, with whom he had made a deal. Jin-soo gave them the MC data for $1 million and a promise not to pursue him for a year. The protagonist called Jin-soo names, angry at him for doing such a thing. He had experienced the death of his parents, false accusations, prison, a car accident, and then the death of his younger brother and sister. Jonathan pulled out a sword, pointing it at him, and suggested that it was time for Junhyuk to die if he had already gotten the answers he wanted. He wondered if he was okay with that. As those unfamiliar words began to make sense to the protagonist, he found a way to reverse his life. And so he asked Jonathan if that was really the case. Before they could begin, he showed the stone lying on his palm and asked his opponents if they knew what it was. Jonathan didn't answer him. His eyes widened, and he frowned in confusion. The protagonist explained that it was an artifact that was rumored to be the rollback stone. Jonathan asked in shock and turned to his comrades, unhappy that they were just standing there. He ordered them to kill MC now, but he had already activated the artifact, and from it began to emanate light, which gradually became brighter. The protagonist, laughing, offered Jonathan to meet in the past. He begged that it was the moment before the disaster, or at least the time when his brother and sister were still alive. At the moment, he finally looked away from his memories and raised his hand, noting that he had entered the world of the past, having spent 23 years to return. In the end, he told Kong Ho his name, thinking that this was still the same world that was on the verge of collapse due to the gate and monster attacks. But still, life goes on. Kong Ho smiled through force, looking at his outstretched palm, and took his hand confidently, squeezing it. This time it was different, and Kong Ho frowned in concentration, declaring the system transfer and named the target as MC. Energy spread from his side, raising dust in some places. And the system warned that the system transfer was starting, but would lead to the destruction of the creator's physical body. That's why it asked Kong Ho to confirm the execution of the command. But he chuckled and noted that he was still a dead man. And so he confirmed the transfer. Since he initiated the system transfer, a new user, Junhyuk, was registered, and streams of magical energy began to converge on him, enveloping his entire body. The creation of a second system original and the transfer of the master copies began. The system began to scan the body of a user, Junhyuk, and he himself suddenly frowned, looking at Kong Ho, who said that he should not let down his guard until the very end. Because although the transfer had already begun, if he was not careful, it could be canceled. The protagonist asked in shock, and at that moment, the wounded monster began to rise behind him, and he froze, frowning. Kong Ho, who also noticed this, cursed and laughed, admitting that life was truly terrible. The protagonist turned around in fear, clenching his jaw, and the monster growled. And Kong Ho sadly added that in fantasy novels, people return home and live happily ever after. He called out to the protagonist, and he looked at him, and Kong Ho noted that he would have to forget about transferring the power and suggested that he just run away before it was too late. He was sorry that things were turning out this way, but at the same time, he knew that he had no choice. However, the protagonist ignored his words and looked around, paying attention to a bent pipe lying a little to the side. Kong Ho added that if life is terrible, then a person will have to live with it. And so he advised the MC to just adapt and survive. However, he took the pipe and stubbornly clenched his jaw, frowning in concentration. The fact that he did this surprised Kong Ho, and he asked him what he was doing. He assumed that the protagonist had gone crazy, but he explained that this was not the case, and he was actually well aware of what he was doing. In fact, he was tired of running away, and so he stood in front of the monster, who growled in displeasure but eventually turned around and began to walk away. Even MC was surprised that this happened, and afterward, he sighed in relief, admitting that he thought he would die from the strain. He threw the pipe aside, and Kong Ho admitted that they were lucky. But the protagonist was sure that it was all thanks to Kong Ho, because if the monster had not been critically injured, it would have attacked. And suddenly, he noticed that Kong Ho's body was gradually starting to dissolve. And he cried out excitedly, but he didn't pay attention to it and reminded him of his words, begging him to find his family and make sure to take care of them. He wouldn't forgive him even in death if he broke his promise. And he pointed at him with his finger in order to strengthen the impression of his words. After that, his body completely dissolved and the system transfer was 100% complete. The system warned that the user's body is not suitable for receiving the system, and it also completely finished scanning the user's body, Junhyuk, so the body restructuring through awakening began. He pressed his lips tighter, waiting for the transfer, and the system warned him to be prepared for the fact that the restructuring process may be associated with some pain. MC jerked, opening his eyes wider, and with difficulty holding back a scream, and the awakening started, but so far it is only loaded at 1%. Soon the MC was shaking. Each time he flinched more and more. He thought that he was trying to hold on, but in reality, it hurt much more than he expected. It felt like all his bones were breaking, and his flesh was falling apart. He arched his back, raising his head up, and screamed in pain. Sometime later, when the sun had already risen, outside the truck that Jiddle was driving came closer. Jickle cried out in surprise when he noticed the MC here and asked why he was here. The protagonist turned around when he heard the car coming closer and turned to Jichel, asking if he had really arrived. He brushed the dust off his clothes, smiling kindly, And Jichel frowned in confusion and asked if today wasn't the protagonist's day off. He remembered that the MC suddenly asked to switch shifts yesterday, so he came today. The protagonist admitted that he was going to go back, but then a monster appeared, so he got stuck here and missed his chance to leave. So he ended up spending the whole night here. Jaw let out a shocked cry when he realized that the protagonist had spent the whole night here, and he assumed that he was tired of living, but he smiled, telling him to forget about it, because thanks to this, he hit the jackpot. He laughed, and Joel didn't understand why he was acting like this. Meanwhile, the MC asked in surprise why Jichel was here at this hour. The thing is, it was a bit early before the workday started, and the protagonist was also wondering where the rest of the team was. Jig hesitated, sweating and scratching his cheek, trying to make an excuse, and in the end, he announced that he was waking up early lately, which is why he came so early. The others were also about to arrive soon, and Junhyuk understood everything but thought that the excuse about Jichel getting up early was nonsense, assuming that he was hiding something useful again. Jichel, meanwhile, remembered what Jung told him and began to tell the MC about it. He thought about Jichel being the leader of the hyena team, and he was the one who originally owned the ability of Spearmaster, which the protagonist stole today. Spearmaster was the ability to copy and use the abilities of other awakened. But Jichel could not use it properly, and Junhyuk assumed that this was why he gradually became an outcast among the other awakened until he was found dead in an abandoned building. In the end, he got into his truck, warning Gile that in that case he would go, and he wished him a good job. Jichel responded in kind, and MC thought that the reason for Gile's downfall was simple, and that was because Gile had revealed his ability to be a copy when he registered as an awakened. He knew that no one would tolerate his skills, which he had worked so hard to obtain, being copied so easily. Soon he was already on his way, his eyes focused on the road ahead of him. But he was briefly distracted by the crystals lying on the seat next to him. There were 3 B-class crystals and 4 C-class crystals. And although he felt a little ashamed in front of Jichel for stealing these crystals, he had almost died for it. So now he just had to figure out what to do with these crystals. Even if he just sold them, he could retire comfortably. But he couldn't do that since these crystals were useless to him anyway. These crystals were rare, and he remembered that Jichel, after awakening his power, was so shocked that he didn't even get to the trophies. However, the protagonist that evening, after awakening his new ability, collected the crystals by going from one destroyed monster to another. When Jichel returned the next day to collect the trophies, there were none. And every time he thought about that moment, he regretted that he didn't take care of the trophies. That was why the protagonist was so diligent in collecting all these crystals. In fact, he had planned to take the loot from the beginning. But now he thought if these were the cores of ordinary monsters, he could sell them carefully. But if he put the cores of high-class monsters on display, it would arouse suspicion. In that case, both the Awakened Association and the government would definitely start investigating where it came from. And in the worst case, he wouldn't even be able to get the full price of these crystals and might be forced to sell them for a pittance. Besides, there could have been a more terrible outcome, and someone would have taken aim at him, and he himself would have ended up as a corpse in an abandoned building. So he came to another conclusion and picked up the phone, dialing the number of the person he was going to talk to. In order to solve this problem, he had to quickly register as an awakened person. And at that time, Kung Chomin finally answered him and asked how he was doing. He wondered what he owed for such a busy man to call. The MC greeted him, explaining that he had finally been given money, and so he thought of having a drink with his friend. Coleman was surprised when he assumed that the protagonist would pay, and he reminded him that he had money and promised that he would throw him a feast of smoked pork belly. Coleman thought that this sounded great, but the protagonist warned that the freebie must first be earned, and Cholin asked in confusion what happened. The MC, meanwhile, drove up to the Soul Safe Zone and explained that Cholin had to do him a favor first. Soon the protagonist met the man and asked how much he was offering for the goods he had offered. This time, the items were very useful, so he was going to give him 600 coins for everything. The MC asked him to add a little more, since in their time, it was very difficult to find anything worthwhile, and he thought his interlocutor knew this. But he put his hand on his neck disappointedly, explaining that in the past, you could get 800 coins for something like this, but now it is too difficult since the number of people looking for expensive goods has sharply decreased. The MC froze in disappointment, and the man explained to him that the population is decreasing, prices are rising, and people are simply not spending money. Suddenly Chanjong and Chunch ran closer to them, bursting into tears, calling out to the MC. They clung to him, crying even harder, and Yin Chul asked why he only came back now. They thought he had abandoned them, and he seriously got their attention and frowned, not understanding what they were doing there. He reminded them that they were supposed to be at school, but the man asked why he was scolding them. He explained that they came here because they were worried about the protagonist not coming back all night, but he didn't answer him. And he added that money was good, of course, but the protagonist also needed to think about what would happen to these children if something happened to him. He finally asked them to stop crying and asked why they were crying. The children covered their eyes with their hands, saying that they were not crying. And finally, the MC suggested that they go home, promising that he would fry meat for dinner. He placed his hands on their heads, and they instantly became happy since they loved meat. Suddenly, Yin Young remembered something and told the protagonist that grandmother upstairs had told the protagonist to come see her when he returned. He realized that she was talking about the landlady, and she confirmed this by telling him that the woman had said that the rent was overdue. The protagonist thought about it and said nothing more. Soon they arrived at apartment 601 and placed the prepared food on the table. They were silent for a while, and eventually the woman excitedly asked why the protagonist had brought all this. He explained that he had gone to the butcher's shop, bought some meat, and thought of her. She remarked that it would be better if he saved it for the children. He did not respond to this, but handed her an envelope, apologizing to her for the delay and explaining that it was the overdue rent. However, the woman warned him that he did not need to rush since she was going to talk about it anyway. She knew that the protagonist had been having a hard time lately, so she decided to only charge him half the amount. He asked her in confusion, but warned her that there was no need. But Changa tried to dissuade him from arguing since they should all help each other in hard times. So he advised the MC not to be shy and just agree. The woman suddenly hit him on the head with a spoon, calling him a bastard, and asked if this was really his house. She reminded him that the house belonged to her and indignantly questioned why he was acting like the boss there. He put his palm to the spot where she had hit him and cried out indignantly, asking if she needed a spoon to scoop rice or to split skulls. He reminded her that after her death, the house would still belong to him. She angrily added that he didn't need to tell her that. He looked at the spoon in fear, screamed, and jerked, expecting the next blow. The woman added that because of him, her stomach was twisted into knots, and she couldn't sleep at night. In her opinion, he wasn't studying but running around doing nonsense that he called being a porter. Changa was outraged that she called it nonsense because he was sure it was studying. She didn't understand what he was studying, and he explained that he was learning how hunters fight in case he became an awakened. Grandma suggested that he study on his own first and asked why he was finishing college. MC watched their quarrel with a smile, and Chango added that now was the time of the awakened and the age of hunters. He was sure that his grandmother had no idea how this world worked. She didn't know what to do with him and asked that at least Junhyuk tell him something since Changu at least listened to him. MC suddenly felt his phone vibrate in his pocket and took it out, noticing an incoming call from Shulman. Meanwhile, the woman added that Chong Su was the only family she had left, but he was very immature. MC didn't say anything and went out to the balcony, accepting the call from Cholin. He reminded him of the business he had asked about before and explained that he had talked to the team captain, who said he should come by sometime. The protagonist happily asked again, and Cholin confirmed that this was indeed true, but added that it would be free. Instead, if the protagonist did well, he could be added to the list of permanent members of the team, albeit in a secondary role. He wondered if this was okay with him, and the protagonist agreed almost without hesitation. Cholin didn't immediately believe it was true and asked why he was suddenly acting like this. The thing was that he had never shown interest in being a porter before. In fact, the protagonist didn't have this interest even now, and he did all this for the sake of saving Cholin. But he explained aloud that working in the hyena team was getting harder and harder, so he began to look for other options. Coleman understood everything and said that tomorrow they were leaving at around 8 a.m. He warned MC to be sure to be near the 7th gate on the western wall no later than 7 in the morning. He understood everything and said goodbye to him until the next day. When he finished the call, he smiled because he was glad that everything was going according to plan. The next day, he approached the gate thinking about his plan because he was going to copy the tank skill today and go to the association. He suddenly heard someone calling him, turned around, and saw Chil Min, who was approaching him, laughing. He noticed that the protagonist had arrived quite early. He greeted him, thinking that after that, he would register as a tank and receive basic equipment. Cholin, meanwhile, turned to Yes Jin and explained to him that he was the friend he had mentioned yesterday. Sanjin understood and introduced himself, explaining that he was the captain of this team. He was older, so he assumed that he could address the protagonist in a more informal manner. He extended his palm to shake hands, noting that Cholin was addressing him respectfully, so he was going to do the same. He was looking forward to working with Sanjin today, and he responded that the feeling was mutual, asking him to try his best. After they shook hands, MC activated the copy, and the system explained that he could choose from 3 skills presented. The first was the unique passive skill Iron Skin Level 1, which added 1,000 points to defense, absorbed 10% of incoming damage, and could also be used without registering in the skill deck. He could also get an active unique skill Shield Strike Level 1, which hit the enemy with a shield, attracted their attention, dealt 300 points of damage, increased the aggression coefficient by 95%, and could be used without registering in the skill deck. The cooldown was 30 minutes, and this skill consumed 100 points of strength. The next skill was the active skill Card Suppression Level 5, which released a powerful aura that intimidated enemies and attracted attention. Thanks to this, the aggression coefficient was also increased by 130%, and the target's attack was reduced by 10%. The cooldown was 1 hour, and the amount of strength consumed to use the skill was 1,000 points. The protagonist decided to copy all 3 skills, and the system asked him for confirmation before starting the copy. He immediately agreed to it. Very soon, the copying of skills was completed, and the copied skills could be viewed in the skill menu. MC smiled as one handshake was enough time, and he was even happier that the job was done and he finally copied the tank skills. Sang Jin looked at him with a puzzled look, and Coleman Min also called out to him, asking what happened to him. He looked at them with a puzzled look, and Coleman asked why he was grinning like that while shaking hands. He thought it was weird, and Sangjin added that the protagonist had a great grip, and he laughed as he liked it. MC let go of his hand, apologizing to him for it, but he warned that everything was fine and suggested that they give it their all today. After that, he pointed to a truck standing a little to the side and said that the protagonist could climb up there. He looked at the team members standing near the truck and getting ready to go on a mission. Among them were Jang De-jin, Kongji Cho, Soyed Jin, Lee Dong-hyuk, Hisu, and the truck driver Sanjin. Sanjin suggested that the protagonist first greet the team members before heading to the hunting grounds. All the people gathered here were rank 1 awakened, and the MC smiled enthusiastically, although he knew that once he started copying the skills of higher rank awakens, the skills taken from these people would become useless. But even though that was the case, he decided that he needed to copy this for now, even if he deleted it later. Soon the truck was already on its way, and the protagonist, sitting next to the rest of the team, thought about it, counting that he had already copied 13 skills while they were driving. He copied 3 skills from healers and looked at Hisu, from whom he took it. He also copied 1 crafter skill, 2 catcher skills, and 7 attack skills. He thought it was incredible, but now he could perform the roles of a tank, attacker, healer, crafter, and catcher. Soon they arrived at a ruined part of the city where monsters were roaming. Sangjin, unhappy with the fact that the monsters were gathering somewhere, activated a shield strike, attacking a monster. Of course, the number of skills that the protagonist could take was limited, and having skills of different roles was a bit difficult. Meanwhile, Sanjin attracted Dong-hyuk's attention, suggesting that he use a long-range attack, and he immediately agreed and ran forward. Using skills of different roles, in the protagonist's opinion, was powerful depending on how it was combined. Dongguk, meanwhile, shot at the monster, wounding it, and Sanjin attracted Yajin's attention, telling her to finish off the monster. She understood everything and shot the monster, finishing it off completely so that it fell to the ground and did not move anymore. Sanjin praised them for their excellent work, calculating that there were only 2 opponents left. The protagonist had nothing else to do and decided to try activating something for fun. But he gave up on the idea, since once activated, he would not be able to change roles for 24 hours. He was going to register as a hunter right after this hunt, so he decided that there was no need to complicate things. Sometime later, the battle was over, and Sanjin laughed since another day had passed without any incidents. He praised everyone and also pointed out that the protagonist's stamina was very good. Today, they had an unusually large amount of offal compared to other days, but he was a little disappointed since this was usually the case. He suddenly noticed another porter who was bending over under the weight of his backpack, admitting that he was going to die. Chillman smiled, telling Sanjin that the MC was quite famous for his fists during his school days. Sanjin was surprised and asked if Chman meant the time before the disaster by school. He confirmed this, admitting that he had a sense for something like that. Technically, the protagonist did not even train, but still the so-called athletes ended up at his feet. The protagonist scratched his cheek with his finger in embarrassment, and Sunjun asked if he was a bully. He did not seem like that kind of person, and Coleman explained that calling Junhyuk a bully was too much since he was the one who beat up the bullies. The thing was, he had a dream of becoming a detective, and Coleman thought that if the world hadn't changed, that's probably what the protagonist would be doing now. In any case, Sanjin got off the topic by praising the protagonist for his good work, and he handed him an envelope with his pay. He asked him again, confused, explaining that he wouldn't take it as he had said so before. Sanjin told him to just take it and thank him for it, because if it weren't for the protagonist today, their porter would have a hard time. He wondered if the protagonist had already thought about continuing to work as a porter. He could arrange a position for him if he wanted it, and the protagonist smiled as he accepted the envelope, promising that he would think about it. Sangjun started to walk away, suggesting that they meet again sometime if the opportunity arose. When he left, Coleman complimented Junhyuk on his work and asked if they would go to the barbecue as agreed. He apologized to him, but explained that he already had plans for today, so he would treat him to meet next time. Coleman was surprised that he had plans and tried to find out more about it, but the MC did not tell him, and Coleman disappointedly asked him not to tell him that he had a date. Sometime later, the protagonist had already arrived at the sole branch of the Awakened Association, approaching the stand only for tanks. The girl who looked at him with confusion remained silent and even opened her mouth in surprise. The protagonist did not say anything either, and in the end, she asked him to repeat what he just said. He explained that he had come to register as an Awakened, and she noted that this was a registration desk for tanks only and asked if he was sure that he had awakened as a tank. He confirmed this and added that he had awakened as a tank today. The girl looked at him thoughtfully, and he, surprised by her reaction, asked if something was wrong. She excitedly cried out, explaining that this was not the case at all, and explained that the protagonist was the first person to awaken as a tank in the last 6 months. She finally got over her emotions and smiled kindly, congratulating him on this, and asked if he had brought his ID. He confirmed this, and soon he was handing her the documents. She pointed to a bench a little to the side, asking him to sit there and wait a little. Soon MC followed her recommendation and lowered his head, thinking. He gradually became sadder and thought that after returning, when he first opened his eyes, he thought he was dreaming. He grabbed his hair and lost himself in memories. When he was in prison, his brother and sister came to visit him, and then he cried when he learned that they died in a car accident. He remembered the moment when he sat on the floor of the cell, hiding his face in his hands and crying. The death of his brother and sister was decisive in his decision to become a villain, and he changed radically very quickly. However, when he came back and saw his brother and sister alive, He felt a lot of joy, and at first, he even thought that it was just a dream. He remembered the moment when he saw his family again, and now he frowned determinedly, promising himself that he would never lose his loved ones again. He was going to protect them at all costs, and clenched his hands in a fist resolutely, looking straight ahead. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of him, and he examined it. According to the reports, the stamina ranged from the lowest at 6,000 points to the highest at 15,000 points. The strength was randomly assigned between 2,000 points and 5,000 points, and the protagonist stats were the maximum for the first awakening. He chuckled to himself, thinking that this was a good start. He was also attracted by the inscription about the formation of the core, and he thought about it and asked himself, "What is this?" He put his hand on his chin, but he still could not remember Giles mentioning anything like this. But in the end, he did not think about it for long and decided that he would find out about everything when the formation was completed, since it had already begun to form. Finally, the girl, who had become accustomed to his attention, approached him. He looked at her thoughtfully, and she returned his ID card to him, explaining that they had finished checking his identity. She pointed to Lim Junhyuk standing next to her, asking the MC to follow him for the test. Junhyuk greeted him and extended his hand for him to shake. The protagonist admitted that it was nice to meet him, and they shook hands. Junhyuk explained that they had prepared everything in advance, so they could start the test now. They walked to the elevator to get to the right place, and the protagonist looked at Junhyuk with a studious look, noticing that he was not an awakened one, so copying him was impossible. He thought that Ji-hun must be awakened if he was working for the association, but it turned out that there were also unawakened personnel here. He looked at him like this the entire way. Finally, they moved to a room where he lay down on a special couch. Junhyuk told him that the test consisted of 3 stages. The first stage was to measure strength and endurance. For this, he attached special wires to the device to the protagonist. When the preparations were complete, Junhyuk began the measurement, and the protagonist froze without moving. After a short silence, Junhyuk warned him that it would take about 10 minutes, so he advised him to just relax. After that, he told him about the second stage of the test, which involved using the active skill of a shield strike. Soon the protagonist, dressed in a tracksuit and armed with a shield, stood in front of a mannequin representing a monster. Ji-hun, as well as the other researcher, were watching from the other room. And in the end, Ji-hun also added that this test included measuring the aggression level. Measuring the aggression level was simple, and Junhyuk just needed to use his skill on the monster dummy in front of him. He took a fighting stance, frowning in concentration, and Junhyuk clarified that it didn't matter which part of the dummy he hit, so he didn't have to be shy. MC activated his shield strike, attacking the dummy, and both researchers' mouths opened wide in surprise. The final step of the test was the third stage of evaluation. Soon Junhyuk had already brought MC a glass filled with a hot drink and handed it to him. Noting that due to the problem with the evaluator selection, this last stage of evaluation would take place in 2 days. The protagonist, while accepting the drink, asked, "Is that really all?" Today, the tests were indeed finished, and Giant explained that the protagonist needed to go to the counter, and they would provide him with basic equipment. He couldn't even believe that the day had actually come when he would receive the association's standard equipment. Junhyuk sat down opposite him and admitted that he was worried about the decrease in the number of awakened tanks and healers. Compared to 5 years ago, during the Great Disaster, the number of healers and tanks had dropped significantly. The protagonist took a sip and widened his eyes, looking thoughtfully at Ji-hun, who looked back at him seriously and said that even though the forced awakened people created with awakening stones would join the ranks of hunters, most of them focused on attacking or supporting roles. Not to mention that awakening stones were not that easy to obtain. Awakening stones for tanks and healers were especially rare. But the biggest problem was that even with an awakening stone, there was no 100% guarantee that a person would awaken. The protagonist knew this well, because he was lucky enough to obtain this stone and awaken while he was wanted as a criminal. When he remembered this, he became more serious and noted that after becoming a villain, He could no longer register as an awakened person. Jian suddenly smiled excitedly, scratching his cheek with his finger, and apologized to the protagonist because it was a long time since he met a tank, so he was overly happy, although he was usually not so talkative. However, the MC thought that everything was fine. Soon he stood up from his seat to leave. Juno warned him that the third stage of the evaluation was scheduled in 2 days, so he asked him to come on the right day. The exact time will be sent to him by text tomorrow. He extended his palm to the male lead for a farewell handshake. He looked at it thoughtfully at first, but soon smiled and admitted that he was looking forward to working together and shook Jian's hand in return. Sometime later, in Old Gyro, the male lead was walking while holding the equipment he had received. He called Cholin and asked if it was convenient for him to talk. He confirmed that it was convenient and asked what happened. The MC explained that it was nothing serious, but he had just suddenly woken up like a tank on the way home. Choman seemed not to understand what he had just heard at first and so reacted calmly. But then he cried out in surprise and asked again. He assumed that the male lead was joking, but he would not joke about something like that. He walked into the store while still talking, assuming that this was the place he was looking for. Coleman asked him at this time if he really woke up as a tank. MC pointed out that he had said this before, and Cholin let out a surprised cry, noting that it was unbelievable. They had only separated a few hours ago, so it was even harder for him to believe what was happening. MC suddenly froze, even with his mouth slightly open in amazement, when he looked at the item he saw on the counter in front of him. Chillman, meanwhile, again noticed in amazement that the protagonist had become a tank, but he did not answer him. So Chillman assumed that the call was disconnected. The protagonist, meanwhile, was focused on the model of the praying mantis's front leg, which cost $3 million. He cursed, not even understanding who would pay $3 million for this garbage. He assumed that these people were crazy, and in the end, he was distracted from his thoughts as Cholin tried to call out to him again. The protagonist said that he could hear him now and noticed that the connection was cut off for a second. He finally explained that he went to the association today and registered as an awakened. He also said that he was told that he would have a test for a rank 3 tank in 2 days, and he thought that watching veteran hunters hunt might help him. That was why he asked Coleman if he could join his team as a porter again. While talking, he was looking through the shelves, looking intently at the items on display, and Cholin asked him if he hadn't seen enough of this today. He explained that he had been too focused on carrying things to properly watch Sanjin's fight. Finally, he found the item he wanted, which was lying on the display case, and Coleman thought about it and asked if that was really the case. He finally asked him to wait for a bit, promising that he would explain the situation to Sanjin and get back to him. MC thanked him for that, and then went to the cashier and explained that he would like to get a bracelet and a solution. If he was not mistaken, it was an artifact that was once owned by Jaden Russell, who was a rank 3 villain. He remembered how he sat at the same table with Russell in the past, before returning to a time when the protagonist was a rank 8 villain. He once managed to drink with Russell, and then he told him about how he acquired the bracelet and also talked about its main functions. Now the seller narrowed his eyes, looking at him thoughtfully, and MC was distracted from thinking about how you can increase the effectiveness of skills by 30% just by equipping this bracelet. He asked the seller what happened. He did not understand why he was looking at him like that and assumed that something was wrong. The man apologized to him for asking, but asked if it was true that he had registered as an awakened today. The protagonist said that it was indeed true, and the man suddenly swung his fist, noting that he knew it. The protagonist froze in fear, and the salesman suddenly smiled kindly and said that he was also unawakened, and his ability was teleportation. The MC replied that he understood everything and asked himself in shock, what was that? He eventually figured out that it was a punch, but for a second, he thought that the salesman was attacking him. He eventually pressed his fist against the man's fist, activating a copy, since the teleportation ability would be useful to him. The second salesman, Huang Mansu, introduced himself and also extended his fist forward, saying that he was an awakened with the ability of spatial manipulation. He was pleased to meet the protagonist, and he responded in kind and was happy about the ability of spatial manipulation since it was exactly what he needed. He used the copy on Mansu as well. Soon another salesman admitted that he had overheard the protagonist's recent conversation, and he assumed that if he was taking the tank test, then he was one. He wondered if that was really true. Manson noted that tanks were actually nobles among the awakened, and he laughed, admitting that he even envied the protagonist. MC never thought that he would meet awakened people here, and he asked if this was a part-time job for them. However, they both answered at the same time that this was their main job. He was surprised and even did not immediately believe that this was really true. The man sighed, explaining that with so many awakened people with utility skills, it was difficult to find a job, and besides, his ability was not very useful in battles. Mansa became the owner of a shop selling antiques and supplies for awakened people in order to make a living. The protagonist finally understood everything and guessed that they were having a hard time in the job market. Finally, the shop assistants placed the solution he had requested in front of him. They calculated that the bracelet and the solution together would cost 350,000 coins, but offered him a discount, selling it for 300,000 coins instead. He thanked them and thought that with this, he had collected all the materials needed for unsealing. The bracelet, the solution, the crystals above D-class that he had at home, and his blood as a binder for everything. Soon, he finished all the preparations, and the resulting artifact was in his possession. He put the twilight bracelet on his hand, admiring it with delight. Suddenly, a system window appeared next to him, announcing that the 38th artifact among the 101 artifacts created by the owner of the original system had been unsealed. The Twilight Bracelet was registered as an installed artifact in the system, making a total of 16 artifacts registered at this point. The protagonist could now see the options of the registered artifact. The Twilight Bracelet was linked to the user of the second original system, Junhyuk. Since it was unsealed by the user of the original system, the item was completely unlocked. The protagonist didn't fully understand what the system meant when it mentioned the 101 artifacts created by the owner of the original system, but he was suddenly distracted from his thoughts as Coleman called him. At first, he was startled by the sound of the incoming call, but eventually he picked up the phone and greeted Coleman. He sighed and explained that he had told Sanjin everything about it. The protagonist froze, listening attentively. Coleman said that no matter how much he explained, Sanjin dismissed it as nonsense and claimed it didn't make any sense. That's why he warned that he would only believe it if he saw it with his own eyes. The protagonist smiled happily and asked if Coleman was joking. He had already assumed that Sanjin had refused. Coleman suddenly laughed and noted that the protagonist was very straightforward. Meanwhile, he activated spatial manipulation, and a portal appeared in the air next to him. Coleman warned that they would meet tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. near the 7th gate. He assumed the protagonist knew where it was and reminded him not to be late. Reaching into the portal, he pulled out a suitcase with equipment and replied that he understood everything. Afterward, he said goodbye to Coleman until tomorrow. The next day, near the appointed place where the rest of the team had already gathered next to the van, the protagonist appeared and greeted them. Sanjin and Coleman froze in shock, their mouths agape as they looked at him. Coleman noticed that the clothes suited him, and Sanjin realized that it was true. The protagonist had awakened as a tank. Coleman gave him a general outline of the situation, but he still couldn't believe it had happened in just one day. The protagonist laughed, agreeing, and explained that he had suddenly awakened yesterday on his way home. Sanjin had heard that the number of natural awakenings had dropped significantly lately, and he was very impressed. The protagonist had already told Coleman about this, but now he informed everyone else that he would be taking a test to become a rank 3 tank the next day. That was why he had come to watch Sanjin command and tank, as he thought it might help him. He apologized to Sanjin for bothering him again. Sanjin thoughtfully put his hand on his chin and realized the protagonist wanted help. He wasn't sure if the protagonist could learn anything from him, but he decided to give him just one piece of advice. As someone who had started doing this earlier than him, Sanjin asked the protagonist if he knew why he was wearing that shield. It wasn't because he had suddenly awakened as a tank, but because it was his choice. He was sure that when a person encounters monsters, there would inevitably come a time when they would feel tired and exhausted. And at such times, one should remember that it's not skills or stats that can bring someone back to the ranks. It's a person's determination. The protagonist listened to him with a smile, and Sanjin frowned seriously to emphasize the weight of his words. Sometime later, they arrived at an area inhabited by monsters and noticed a monster sleeping in an empty square. Ji-hun, peeking out from around the corner, turned to his comrades and asked if they had identified the type of prey and its location. They confirmed it was a drone, and he understood everything, then suggested they begin. He turned to Daeon and asked him to check the monster's location again. Daeon firmly replied that he understood everything and summoned the map. Sanjin looked at it, confirmed the monster's type, and turned his attention to the glowing dots on the model, noticing that there were 2 F-class drone monsters. As far as his comrades knew, these monsters had low attack power and sluggish movements, but their defense was as high as E-class monsters. The protagonist looked at his other teammates with concentration. Coleman suddenly cried out sadly because he doubted they had enough strength left to deal with the drone. Donnick lowered his head, already feeling exhausted, and wondered how long it would take to break through those shields. Someone asked if this was okay, and Joel worriedly said that at this distance, if something happened to the other team, even the drones might run at them. There was indeed such a possibility. But Sanjin warned that their prey was slow, and Sunham's group was one of the most experienced veteran teams in the field. As long as they did the same as always, there should be no problems. Who smiled and guessed that if the drone's attack power was low, she, as a healer, would have an easy day. However, she also guessed that the attackers might have a hard time and laughed. Sanjin drew Ji Cole's attention to himself and asked if all the traps were set. He replied that everything was ready, and Sanjin called Coleman and Junhyuk to follow him. He told the protagonist and who to stay behind. The protagonist seriously replied that he understood everything, and the rest of the team began to approach the monster. The protagonist had a feeling that something was wrong and frowned. Although he didn't know all the details, he remembered that the reason Coleman's team was destroyed before returning to the past was due to another monster's invasion. However, if the invading monster was a drone, they should be able to handle it. So, he didn't understand how they were all destroyed. He looked around intently, certain that something was amiss. Eventually, Sanjin called out to Eugene and asked if she was ready. She replied that she was, and in that case, he told her to start shooting. She aimed and fired at the monster, but the arrow didn't hurt it much. Eugene frowned and announced that she had hit the drone and was now moving on to the next target. Sanjin closed his eyes, sighed, and realized that everything was happening as he expected. The sleeping drone woke up, stood up, and Sanjin warned the others that the monster was coming. He ordered the ranged attackers to prepare. Coleman and Junhyuk responded. The monster swung its paws to attack, and Junhyuk fired several arrows into the monster's body at once, causing the drone to scream in anger. Junhyuk exclaimed that the strike was excellent, and his comrades praised him for the good shot, but warned him to keep his distance. However, despite their advice, he shouted that he was moving forward and headed toward the monster, ignoring their attempts to convince him that it was too early and that he should stay back. The monster swung its paw in anger, but Junhyuk dodged it and asked how much longer they were going to poke the drone in the back. He wanted to get it over with and go home. So he shot the monster a few more times, hitting the target perfectly. The drone tried to attack him a few more times, but he dodged and shot again. His comrades didn't give up trying to dissuade him and suggested he stop angering the monster and listen to them. He noted that he wasn't angering anyone. After all, the monster was so slow that it wouldn't be able to hit him anyway. Meanwhile, the drone swung, delivering a powerful blow, and Junhyuk was unable to dodge. He flew into the wall, and Coleman excitedly called out to him, but he didn't react. The rest of the team cursed, realizing that Junhyuk had provoked the monster. Coleman warned that he was also entering the nearest distance and approached the monster from behind, jumping up to strike. He frowned in concentration, but when he plunged the dagger into the monster's body, he was unable to do much damage. The drone only became angrier and growled. Coleman, who had fallen to the ground, cursed and warned the others that the drone's shield was too strong, so nothing was helping. Meanwhile, The monster continued to focus its attention on Junhyuk, who was leaning against the wall, exhausted. Gradually, the drone, growling threateningly, approached him and swung its paw to deliver a decisive blow. Junhyuk, noticing this, screamed in fear and put his hands in front of himself to somehow protect himself. But Sanjin arrived in time, using a blow from his shield to approach the monster and hit it with such force that the drone flew to the side, lost its balance, and fell, raising clouds of dust into the air. Sanjin himself frowned in concentration so as not to miss the monster's further movements. The area was quiet for a moment, but the monster soon stood up, angrier than before, and began looking around for a new target. Finally, it focused its attention on Sanjin, who called out to Junhyuk and Min, explaining that he would provoke the drone toward him. He ordered Min to prepare for long-range attacks and Yejin and Junhyuk to prepare for close-range attacks. They acknowledged his orders, and he used suppression. Waves of energy began to spread out from him, provoking the monster, which opened its mouth wide, showing sharp fangs, and growled. Sanjin frowned, realizing that he had managed to provoke it, and the drone began to swing its paws, striking him. He put up a shield in front of himself and screamed, but managed to stand his ground and block all of the drone's attacks. Once again, as the monster raised its paws to strike, an attack flew past its body. Junhyuk warned Yejin that they should act now. She responded, indicating that she understood, and took aim, pulling back the bowstring of her weapon. Finally, she fired, hitting the monster's head directly. Although no obvious damage was done, the drone trembled in discomfort before curling up, exposing its hard shell and protecting its more vulnerable parts. Sanjin ran toward the drone, shouting to Min that he should use a long-range attack. Min shouted that he was already prepared, and from both sides, they ran toward the monster, raining down more blows on it. Sanjin warned everyone to continue with basic attacks until the next command. Min, who was also trying to break through the monster's shield, cursed and admitted that just looking at the monster's back was already tiring him out. They continued to strike, suggesting that the monster should just die already. The protagonist continued to watch them from the side, remaining silent and lost in thought, who suddenly sighed, closing her eyes and lowering her head because she understood that if this continued, it would be the end of their hunt today. It seemed like a big disappointment to her, and she didn't understand why something like this always happened to them. The protagonist didn't understand what she meant when she said this always happened, and she explained that the drone was not a monster that appeared often. She put her hand to her head excitedly, noting that if a person was unlucky, they might encounter a drone once or twice a year. The protagonist looked at her carefully and asked how many times their team had killed such monsters. She told him that their group had encountered a drone for the third time in the last 5 months, as if they were cursed or something. Suddenly, she was distracted from her dejected mood and chuckled, noting that judging by the protagonist's questions, he was eager to learn something new. He apologized to her, assuming he might have bothered her with his questions, but she didn't seem annoyed. On the contrary, she handed him a device that could help him. He was surprised when he realized it was an M7, who told him that the official name of this device was the Jeremy M7, a measuring device developed by Jeremy Corporation. The protagonist looked at the device in amazement, his mouth dropping open in bewilderment. Who smiled, reminding him that he was there to watch them hunt before his third test. However, she didn't think it was appropriate to just stare, so she asked if he agreed with that. Using the M7 to analyze stats, she thought could really help the protagonist. Instead of answering, he picked up the device and put the lens to his eye. Looking at the battle going on with the M7, his mouth dropped open in shock. Who announced that, for example, the drone's health was 30,000 points and its shield was 150,000 points. Thanks to the device's effect, the protagonist could see these stats next to the drone's body, who suddenly became sad again, closing her eyes and lowering her head. She said that 30,000 points of health was a lot compared to most monsters, and a shield of 150,000 points was completely discouraging. The protagonist frowned in concentration, realizing that it would take forever to break through all of this. But he was suddenly distracted from his conversation with Hu as someone screamed in shock, not understanding what was happening. Daeon drew the attention of the others, warning that they had a problem. Sanjin didn't understand what he was talking about when he mentioned a problem, and Daeon announced that the life signals of the 4 team members on the other side had disappeared from the map. Sanjin asked in amazement, guessing that Daeon's words meant that Sunam's group had been destroyed. Daeon frowned seriously, and the protagonist, standing nearby and hearing everything, widened his eyes in surprise. He was horrified that the other team's indicators had disappeared, and he abruptly turned around, focusing his attention on the warehouse, standing a little to the side. The walls of it gradually began to shake, and after a while, cracks appeared, which grew larger and larger. Finally, a hole appeared in the wall, and a bloody monster emerged through it. The rest of the team realized that praying mantises were coming, and they screamed in horror. One of the monsters crawled out of the building completely, and the protagonist, watching this, mentally exclaimed that this was bad. The others still couldn't believe that the praying mantises were coming here, and they cursed over and over again, wondering how much time was left before these monsters arrived. Meanwhile, the praying mantis stretched its limbs, preparing for a quick dash. Daeon thought that the mantis would arrive in 3 minutes at most, but he immediately corrected himself, warning that these monsters could appear even earlier. He was genuinely scared, beads of sweat appearing on his face from excitement. Sanjin warned the protagonist and Hu to leave and find somewhere safe to wait. The protagonist didn't react to his words at all, but realized that the uneasy feeling he felt earlier was due to the fact that they were dealing with praying mantises. Stubbornly clenching his jaw, he thought deeply. Meanwhile, Sanjin ordered Yajin to hold her position and told Jikol to prepare the binding traps. The protagonist grabbed Hu's hand and pulled her to the side, warning her that they needed to leave. She was also very scared, her eyes wide and sweating from fear. She didn't immediately understand what was happening, but eventually agreed with the protagonist. However, instead of moving further away, he ran toward Sanjin and the other team members. They noticed this, called out to him, ordered him to stop, and asked where he was going. The protagonist didn't stop, but turned toward them and explained that retreating at such a distance was almost impossible. If the mantis caught them, it would tear them to shreds. As he said this, Sanjin also noticed that they were approaching him rather than following orders. He called out to Junhyuk, assuming he hadn't heard him, and reminded him that he had told him to retreat. But the protagonist stubbornly stood in front of him, putting his shield forward, and warned that retreat was not an option because the mantis was too fast. They would still need another 30 minutes to deal with the drone, which was why he wasn't going to retreat. Sanjin frowned, pressing his lips tighter, but said nothing. The protagonist asked what would happen if the mantis showed up now. He explained that they would almost certainly be destroyed in that case, and got into a fighting stance, preparing to take the monster's attacks. The mantis was approaching them with rapid leaps, but the protagonist didn't move from his place, even when the monster was very close to him. He was sure that in this situation, all they could do was hold out as long as possible. He shouted this, frowned resolutely, and prepared to fight. Sanjin looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he had gone crazy, but he did not answer. Sanjin then asked if he thought all awakened tanks were the same. He noticed that MC was just a newbie who had not yet received his awakened registration card. However, the protagonist continued to stand there, looking intently at the monster. Sanjin wanted to say what would happen if a newbie who hadn't even completed a virtual battle yet recklessly attacked the mantis. But before he could finish, the monster swung its claw, delivering a powerful blow. The protagonist took it on his shield, and despite the force of the blow, he managed to stand firm. Cholin called out to him excitedly, and MC noted that he would still go to the battlefield as soon as he got his card, so he didn't understand what the problem was. Sanjin frowned, dissatisfied with this explanation. The protagonist, who continued to reflect the mantis blows, noted that the tanks should still take the blow. When he reflected another blow, he ran a little to the side and then used a shield strike, attacking the mantis. Cholin and Sanjin's eyes widened, and their mouths dropped open in shock when they saw this maneuver. The protagonist added that he needed to learn as much as he could beforehand to avoid making mistakes in real fights. Sunjin and Coleman snapped out of their shock and asked how he could even say such a thing. Coleman reminded him that this was a real fight and called him a crazy idiot. The protagonist did know that this was a real fight, but he asked if they shouldn't be worried about something else instead of him. At this time, the drone that was no longer being hit stood up, and Sanjin and Coleman froze when they realized what the MC was talking about. They turned around to look at the monster, and the protagonist warned that if Sanjin couldn't hold the drone in this narrow passage, they would be destroyed. The monster looked at its opponents with fury and growled, then swung its paw to attack. Kyle Min and Sunjin prepared for battle, and Sunjin managed to take the blow. In the end, he admitted that Junhyuk was right and warned Donghuk to go to the protagonist and buy them some time, since he was a long-range attacker. He warned that he understood everything and ran to the side to get closer to the protagonist, who at this time continued to take the attacks of the mantis. Sanjin attracted the attention of Cholin and warned that he would stay with him on the drone. It showered him with blows, and with another powerful attack, the monster managed to throw him aside. Sanjin fell, losing his balance, and cried out in pain. The blow of the monster was so strong that he did not immediately stop when he fell to the ground but rolled some distance back. When his body finally stopped, he frowned and clenched his jaw, drawing Gichkal's attention to him. He ordered him to use the binding trap on the drone. Ji responded instantly, swung his arm, then threw the trap under the monster's legs. When it opened, chains flew out from it, entangling the monster's legs. This restricted the drone's movements, and Jia warned his comrades that the binding would last for 5 minutes. Sanjin began to rise, looking around intently, and he noticed that there was a drone in front of them and a mantis behind them. And in such a tight space, their only escape route was already blocked. They had barely managed to buy time, but the situation was still hopeless, and they were truly left with a dire situation with no way out. While he was thinking about this, Dongyuk and Junhyuk continued to fight the mantis. The protagonist clenched his jaws in concentration, and sparks flew off when the mantis hit his shield. Dongyuk, also frowning in concentration, fired arrows toward the mantis, but they simply bounced off the monster's shell without causing any harm. However, for a while, the mantis was distracted by the arrows flying at it. An MC managed to take advantage of this once again and used a shield strike, attacking the mantis. And from this attack, the mantis trembled. However, soon the trembling stopped, and the monster only got more angry. But before it had time to attack the protagonist, a powerful attack flew into the head of this one, causing the mantis to stagger slightly. The protagonist frowned in confusion and turned around, and Yejin said that putting this monster down with one blow is not as easy as expected. Dong praised her for her excellent shot, and she let out a dissatisfied cry, asking who he thought she was. At that moment, the mantis turned towards her, then lifted its upper body to move faster. Soon, the mantis had already jumped onto the building that Yajin was hiding inside, and the rest of her team cursed, ordering her to leave right now. As the mantis had changed its focus, she clenched her jaws and frowned, cursing as she realized that the situation was getting worse. The mantis swung its claws, striking, and this sent Yijin flying to the side. The mantis managed to inflict several wounds, and blood began to flow out of those wounds. Yijin cried out in pain, and Dongyuk, who heard this, excitedly called out to her and shot at the mantis, trying to get its attention. The arrow bounced off the shell, but the monster didn't pay any attention to it, and Dongyuk cursed, clenching his jaws in displeasure. Hissa didn't know what to do and asked how she could help. She bit her thumb with her teeth in excitement, and MC looked at her seriously and then thought about it, as he knew that the provocation wouldn't grow in a straight line and add to the already existing value. He admitted that he was too careless and focused on the bracelet on his palm. He supposed that just using the shield strike twice would be enough to keep the mantis focused on himself. In the end, he frowned, opening the stats, as he realized that if he couldn't pull this monster away, it would rush straight at Yajin. The system window in front of him showed the data for the Twilight bracelet. It was the 38th artifact out of the 101 artifacts created by the owner of the original system and was unsealed and fully unlocked by the user of the system. This bracelet increased the effectiveness of skills by 50%, and during the use of it, the power consumption of skills was reduced by 30%. In addition, the bracelet provided options applied during the formation of the core. It increased all stats by 100 points and also increased strength by 2,000 points and made the active skill teleport available. In addition, the bracelet was part of a set, and the remaining set of artifacts were the necklace of sunset and the ring of blossom. The protagonist understood that the risk of using the bracelet was high, but the fact that it increased the effectiveness of skills by 50% during the use of it attracted him. In the end, he activated the bracelet and applied suppression, and powerful waves of energy began to spread from his body and reach the mantis, who had already squeezed through the hole formed in the wall in order to finish off Yejin. She leaned helplessly against the wall, holding her hand over the most bleeding wound, and was breathing heavily, desperately looking at the monster in front of her. MC could only hope that the bracelet's stats would work, and he begged for the monster to come back. Aijin seemed more and more agitated, and the monster still remained in place, looking at her, and the protagonist began to beg again for it to come back. He continued to hold the suppression, hoping to attract the monster's attention. Hisu, who was standing next to him, suddenly admitted in a low voice that she did not want any of this. Her eyes widened, looking at the monster in the distance in horror, and a bead of sweat appeared on her cheek. In the end, she could not stand it any longer, turning around and running away from the protagonist. Even when he called out to her, she did not react at all. However, he was quickly distracted from this as he noticed that the use of the skill worked, and suddenly someone tried to shout to him and asked if he could hear him. It was Sanjin, who asked him discontentedly why he wasn't answering. He suggested that he hurry up and get out of there, but MC replied that everything was fine and frowned in concentration, watching the mantis. Sanjin didn't understand what he meant when he said that everything was fine. At that moment, the mantis jumped off the wall, and the protagonist explained that he had already turned the attention of this monster back to himself. Sanjin was shocked that he had already returned the focus of the mantis to himself. At that time, the monster, which had landed on the ground with such force that a cloud of dust rose in the air, gradually began to approach the protagonist. He did not wait for it to come closer and attack, but ran forward, striking one of the monster's limbs with his shield. He knew that it was too risky to maintain the provocation with only basic attacks. Although he tried to avoid using the copied skills, he now felt that there was no choice. So he activated the skill, Destructive Body. When a system window appeared in front of him, it asked him to choose whether to register the skill or not. MC confirmed the skill registration, and at this time, the mantis swung its limb to attack him. He jumped to the side, dodging the attack, and noted that he had just equipped the passive attacker skill. This would make his basic attacks comparable in damage to the attack skills. He jumped to the side, pausing for a moment and waiting, and then realized what was coming next. He suddenly smiled excitedly, although he had been focused the entire time, as he felt the same feeling he had been expecting. It was a feeling he had experienced countless times before the time reversal, and it felt like every cell in his body was awakening. As he was thinking about this, Junhyuk took advantage of the situation and shot at the monster. But the arrow bounced off again. Before the reversal, when the protagonist awakened as an attacker and became a villain, this feeling earned him the 8th rank among the villains, and it was hyperperception. While the mantis was distracted by Junhyuk shooting at it, the protagonist ran forward, striking it with his shield. He became more focused again and clenched his jaws from the effort. Because he added an attack skill to himself, the power of his attack increased, so he managed to pierce the shell of the mantis, and cracks appeared on it. At this time, in the building, Yejin tried to get up and took her weapon to join the fight and help her comrades, but she dropped the arrow before she could even draw the bowstring. She cursed as she looked at her bloody hand and cried out in pain. She was losing too much blood and could not exert any force, and because of this, she was very disappointed. But suddenly, Hisu came closer to her, frowning in concentration, stretching her hand forward, pointing her skill at Yajin. She screamed when she noticed her, but Hisu warned her not to scream, as it was distracting her. She concentrated on her wound, healing it, and Yajin bowed her head slightly, embarrassed, and asked why she was doing something that was unnecessary. She suggested that she should spend her time on the protagonist instead, since she had time to heal. However, Hisu warned her not to worry about MC, since she couldn't heal him anyway if he wasn't losing health. She was briefly distracted, turning to the side and looking out the window at MC's battle with the mantis. She remarked that Junhyuk was crazy and asked if Yajin agreed with that. This conclusion was due to the protagonist taking all the damage as if he was the leader of their team. In a way, she thought he was even amazing. The protagonist continued to run around the mantis, attacking it from time to time, while Coleman and Sunjin remained focused on the other monster, striking it one after another. The drone roared in anger, but it could not attack too strongly as the trap it had fallen into was still active. Eventually, the team realized that the monster's shield would not last long, and Sanjin suggested that Coleman not waste time on basic attacks, but simply bombard the drone with skills as they needed to finish before the trap wore off. Coleman looked at him doubtfully and asked what would happen if they drew the monster's attention to themselves. However, Sanjin was determined to keep its attention on himself at all costs, and so he ordered them to do as he had told them before. He frowned in concentration while the monster raised both its paws and roared, preparing to deliver a crushing blow. This was the attack that Sunjin was waiting for, and he put out his shield. While the main part of the monster's body was exposed due to its swinging, he ran forward while using a shield strike. The binding trap was supposed to disappear in 10 seconds. And when Sanangjun heard this warning, he called out to Cholin, warning him to act now. He reacted instantly and jumped up, holding his dagger ready, and then activated a critical strike. He dealt a powerful slash to the monster's body, and as the skill took effect, he began to beg for the drone to explode. Nothing happened for a while, but finally, the monster's body began to evaporate, disintegrating into a large number of small particles. Chman realized that the attack worked, so he cried out in joy. This was the final blow, and Sunjin warned the others that their job was done here. When the monster's body dissolved completely, Coleman noticed the items dropped by the drone in the place where it had been. He called out to Sangjin, then walked closer to the items he had received and was surprised that they had received a core and a skill card. He cried out in joy, noting that this was a jackpot. But Sangjin warned him that this was not the time to say that and suggested that he quickly go help the protagonist. However, when they looked at the MC fighting the mantis, they noticed that cracks and dents had appeared on the monster's body, and blood was flying in different directions from the protagonist's blows. They were shocked that something like this had happened. In the end, Junhyuk looked at them and asked them to take this monster on themselves if they were done with their hunt. Cholin chuckled in amazement, shocked to think that the protagonist was truly insane. He reminded them that he had done everything himself and asked if he was now telling them to take this monster for themselves. They didn't think he had much trouble in this fight, so they suggested that he take it as a learning experience and finish off the mantis himself. He paused briefly from attacking and jumped to the side, stopping to catch his breath. He asked again, a little unsure, if he should really destroy this monster himself. He launched another attack, running closer to the mantis, and one of his comrades declared that he had no objections, asking what the others would say. No one objected except for Yejin, who seriously declared that she was not the type to live in debt. She pulled the bowstring, aimed, and fired. And the powerful blow that flew towards the praying mantis did quite a bit of damage to it. The protagonist, taking advantage of the fact that the monster was distracted, jumped up, frowning in concentration, and fell on the monster's head, plunging the shield into the body of the praying mantis. Very soon, the monster had already fallen to the ground. Sanong-jin, standing next to Cholin, raised an eyebrow in surprise and called out to him. Cholin, as shocked as Sangjin, responded, and Sanangjin, who was focusing on the protagonist's shield plunging into the body of the praying mantis, explained that he wanted to talk about Colin's friend. Meanwhile, the protagonist pulled the shield out of the monster and frowned in concentration, and Sanjin asked if Coleman was sure the MC really awakened as a tank. Sometime after the battle ended, the team members began to gather near the truck. They decided to hurry up in order to prepare for departure. Sanjin clapped his hands, getting everyone's attention. And although he knew that they were all tired and exhausted, he suggested that they work at a faster pace, since if they were late, more monsters might appear. While the others were gathering, the protagonist stood to the side, wiping the blood of a mantis off his shield. Coleman came closer to him and asked if it was true that he used that thing back then. The protagonist didn't understand what he was talking about, so Coleman explained. He meant hyperception. He also began to wipe the blade of his dagger and remembered that the protagonist used hyperception every time he had a hard time in a fight during high school. The protagonist looked at him thoughtfully, but said nothing. Coleman admitted that otherwise, the move the MC showed back then wouldn't make any sense. However, he didn't dwell on it for long and excitedly asked how Junhyuk was. The thing was, he remembered that back then, using this ability would give him a headache for the whole day. He said that he felt fine for now and suggested that it might be because he woke up. Coleman admitted that he was even jealous and exclaimed that some people are successful no matter what they do. He smiled and added that the MC was treating him to a drink today and warned that he wouldn't accept any excuses. However, the protagonist was distracted from talking to him because he heard his phone ring. He looked at it in amazement. In the end, he answered Coleman that they would meet another time since he needed to spend time with his siblings today. Before he could even accept the challenge and answer his siblings, he heard someone ask him in confusion. Who exactly was he? Sanjin, who had come closer, crossed his arms, frowned, and asked suspiciously if the protagonist had really just awakened yesterday. He couldn't understand how someone who was completely new to awakening could fight like that. The MC looked at him and agreed. Sanjin asked in confusion, while Coleman turned his head, watching their conversation more closely. The protagonist eventually shrugged, explaining that the situation was a stalemate, and so he assumed that he had unknowingly unleashed some kind of superhuman power. In fact, he himself was surprised that it had turned out this way. And when he said this, Sanjin leaned closer to him and asked, "If that's true, then you don't think I believe it, right?" Junhyuk didn't answer him, and Sunjun turned to the rest of the group and drew their attention to himself. He warned that he had something to tell them all, and when he made sure that everyone was looking at him, he exclaimed that the protagonist had defeated the praying mantis himself today, but he hadn't yet been officially registered as an awakened. And although the circumstances left no other choice, Junhyuk and all of them could face the consequences of the battle before registration. The protagonist looked at him in surprise, and in his mind, he screamed in horror, almost becoming the villain again. Sanjin finally suggested that they leave everything that happened today between them and the MC. He even opened his mouth when he heard these words. Yajun smiled, agreeing with these words, and Dongguk also agreed, telling Sanjin not to worry about them. He asked if he really thought they were so stupid that they didn't know this. Joel laughed, promising that they would take this secret with them to their graves. The MC timidly called out to Sanjin, trying to get his attention so he could say something, but he didn't listen and simply thanked him. This only surprised Junhyuk more. He asked again, and he explained that they would have all died today if it weren't for the protagonist. He turned to him, smiled, and noted that this was why he had decided to include him in the profit sharing this time. He also specified that he would be included in the profit sharing as a tank, and the protagonist was astonished, asking him to wait as he realized that this meant the others would have to accept a smaller share. He asked in shock if that was really the case. Who, coming closer, confirmed that it was, but asked who would complain. The MC said her name, but he did not continue speaking right away. Eventually, he turned to everyone, asking them to let him know if anyone had anything to say. Who lightly punched him in the chest with her fist and said with a smile that in that case, she would just stop treating them. She laughed kindly. At that moment, the protagonist's phone suddenly rang again. He apologized to the others, explaining that he needed to answer. Who was curious about who was calling him and assumed it was his girlfriend, but he explained that it wasn't, noting that it was his brother and sister calling from home. However, When he looked at the phone screen, he noticed that the call was not from his family at all, but from the association. He himself was surprised by this and raised one eyebrow, but answered the call. Sometime later, he was already standing in the test room and asked if this one was rescheduled. Junhyuk revealed that today, the hunters who were previously sent to Thailand were returning. The MC didn't understand how the return of the hunters was related to his test, and Junhyuk explained that a week ago, C-class monsters had appeared in Hong Kong, and top hunters, not only from Korea, but also from Japan, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, were sent there. In terms of hunter strength, Korea ranked third in Asia after China and Japan. But in this mission, Korea contributed more than Japan, and this was the only thing everyone was talking about in the media. That was why it was natural for the association to focus on this. The protagonist realized that they just wanted to get rid of him quickly, and he frowned, decisively saying that he understood everything. In the end, he suggested that they begin. Junhyuk apologized to him for the rush and explained that the test would be conducted in the form of a virtual battle. The protagonist looked intently at the empty space in front of him, and Junhyuk added that the suit and shield he was currently wearing were special testing equipment. As he explained this, the lasers began to form an illusion of a monster. The protagonist, watching this, noticed that it was similar to the simulation room he was in before the cooldown. Junhyuk, meanwhile, added that the monster he would be going up against would be an F-class Xerus, and the test would last for 1 hour. The longer the protagonist could hold out, the higher the result would be. That was why Junhyuk advised him to give it his all. Finally, he turned back and warned the other people who were in the room with him that the preparations were finished. They stood there, looking at him with concentration, and he asked them if they could begin. One of the men nodded, letting him know that it was indeed okay to begin. And he, after telling them that he understood everything, leaned toward the microphone and warned the MC that the test was starting. He put his shield in front of him, and, at that moment, the monster swung to attack him. He managed to dodge this attack, and without distracting himself from the battle, he asked himself, "Were the top hunters here now?" Before thinking about it further, he got closer to the monster and used a shield strike, which caused the Xerus to fly off a little to the side. But it managed to maintain its balance. For a while, both the protagonist and the monster stood there without attacking, and the MC realized that if he could use this opportunity to copy any of these hunters, regardless of their class, then it would be great. The monster bared its fangs, preparing to attack, and the protagonist smiled, because if he did everything right, he could hit the jackpot. The monster rushed to attack Junhyuk, while he thought that for now, he just needed to pass the test. He put up a shield in front of himself, understanding that the heightened senses for someone as big as Xerus were impressive, and the average hunting time was 4 hours. MC closely watched Xerus's movements, dodging the sweeping blows while he thought that if the results in the third stage of the test were significantly better than the second, it would increase the suspicion of the association. Thinking about this, Junhyuk continued to dodge each blow with an unperturbed expression. Soon after, he took a direct hit from Xerus with the center of his shield, deciding that with movements done like a textbook, they would not suspect anything as long as he filled the time without trying too hard. But at the same time, he did not slow down. He held back the monster's blow with his shield. And 3 hours after these events, he continued to hold back blows with the same shield. Junhyuk, with a bored expression, watched what was happening and thought that the same movements had been happening for all 3 hours, and he seemed confident himself and secretly expected something. But now he understood that it would be happiness if he simply did not fail the test. He began to ask himself if he should continue to watch at all because they were probably judges. Suddenly, he turned back and saw 3 puzzled faces of judges. One of them, with a smile on his face, said that he did not know how to explain it, and then asked if they would really witness the birth of a super rookie after so much time. The girl judge said that when the monster opens up, he immediately attacks, and when the time comes, he instantly retreats, and the level of aggression towards himself is stable. The judge in glasses said that the most amazing thing is that he deflects attacks with minimal movements for all 3 hours. The female judge apologized for the interruption and explained that she needed to go to the bathroom and would be right back. Shortly after the girl left, the male judge remarked that he thought he had overeaten at breakfast and needed to take a quick bathroom break as well. The guy with glasses smiled as they left the room and then began to excitedly watch Junhyuk's battle, stating how agile he was, just like a little rat. Taking off his glasses and with a serious expression, the guy suggested he thought it was pointless to continue the test. Jinna asked him in confusion if he thought so. The guy with a serious expression took his phone out of his pocket and told Jonah that he would also step away for 1 minute. At the same time, the female judge was talking on the phone and was saying that she would be talking about the tank that had been signed up for the test today and its maximum potential. The male judge, standing on the stairs, was also telling his interlocutor that this person was amazing. The interlocutor asked him what amazing meant, to which the man asked his interlocutor if he remembered how the master said that the movement, as in the textbook, is the most difficult. The judge guy watching Junhyuk's action spoke on the phone about how this man is the textbook. After which, looking at how Junhyuk again reflects the blow with a shield, he confirmed, noting that he thinks that everything is correct, and now the other two guilds can also take action. And if they do not do anything first, then everything possible must be done so that everyone else cannot do anything. Soon after these events, Junhyuk was issued a certificate of awakening. The girl at the reception told him with a smile on her face that this was his awakened registration card and that he had done a great job. MC began to carefully examine the card, after which the girl explained to him that getting a C class on the first awakening was really amazing. MC began to ask her why a C class and did he do something wrong. The girl began to say that this was not true and that it was rare to get a C class on the first awakening. Junhyuk silently and thoughtfully looked at her, after which the girl told him that they usually get an E or F class. Leaving the room, Junhyuk began to ask himself why he got a C class again. He understood that he had not done anything special and was just fighting, trying to save as much strength as possible. But then a smile appeared on his face because he understood that in any case, the registration was over, and now all that was left was to do legal things and live a happy life with his brother and sister. When he left the building, he heard hysterical exclamations of people confessing their love. The MC looked to the side with interest and saw a huge crowd of people being held back by armed police. The crowd was shouting names and confessing their love. All these shouts were directed at 3 people who were walking towards the association building. Looking at them, Junhyuk thought about what was said about the arrival of several hunters on a mission in Thailand. The girl was Kong Jun, ranked 2nd in the national attacker ranking. The guy with a smile on his face was ranked 1st in the national attacker ranking. His name was Kim Yunho. The third stern man was Lee D-So, ranked 1st in the national tank ranking. The MC looked at D-So with disappointment and began to ask himself what was wrong with him and why did he look so unhappy. He knew that he was famous for his bad temper, and he knew that he would probably get into trouble if he started talking to him. Soon after, Junhyuk decided that it didn't matter and he would do it whether it worked or not. The MC approached the hunters, who looked at him in surprise. Shortly after, Junhyuk confusedly greeted them and said that he was a fan and it was an honor to meet them. With a smile on her face, June told him that she was also pleased to meet him and asked if he wanted her to sign something. Junhyuk confusedly explained that this was not the case and that he was a fan of Dao. D-So looked at him in sincere bewilderment and asked again, menacingly. The MC, frightened with beads of sweat running down his face, began to realize that he had done something wrong. Dao brought his face closer to him and asked again what he had just said. Confused, Junhyuk replied that he said that he was his fan. After which, a happy D-So turned to his comrades and asked them if they heard that. Yunho chuckled, and John, with a displeased expression, cursed and said that she almost got it. The MC looked at them puzzled. After which, John, with a displeased expression, said that if that monkey hadn't appeared 30 minutes before this event, D-So declared that he also had fans. At that moment, they were riding in a long, solid black limousine. Ji asked him again in disbelief, after which she began to talk about how after the incident when someone approached him claiming to be his fan, he threw that person out because he was annoying. Jian then noticed that she did not see anyone else who would call themselves a fan of D-So. D-So looked at her with an angry expression, and Jian guessed that she didn't think she had seen anyone like that. She then asked Dao if he knew that she didn't like men who lie. Diso asked her with a smirk on his face, lie? He then asked her if she didn't know who he was. Diso proudly declared that he was the #1 tank in the entire country. And did she really think that he didn't have a single fan after the statement? John suggested to him that if at least one person showed up as his fan before they got to the association, she would agree to eat with him alone, just like he wanted. Diso happily asked her if she was serious. John continued to say that if no one showed up, he would have to help her once. Diso frowned and asked her again, help. John started talking about how they were planning to attack a C-class monster in Genesis. But as he knew, their guild had strong attackers and they lacked tanks. Jian pointedly tucked her hair behind her ear and said that if he lost this bet, he would have to be the main tank for once. She then added that he would do it for free, causing Dao to be genuinely confused. However, Dao was currently incredibly happy, and Jian was very annoyed. Grinning, Dao asked Junhyuk if he was really his fan. Looking at the happy Dao, Junhyuk thought that this was absurd and that it might be better for him to just run away. Suddenly, Diso extended his hand to him, causing Junhyuk to be confused. With a friendly expression, he said that he wanted to sign something for his fan, but he didn't have a pen, so he suggested that they just shake hands. MC looked at his hand confusedly and agreed with this while asking himself what was going on. He respectfully shook Dao's hand, thinking that anyway, everything was going great, and he had copied the skills. Diso then asked Junhyuk what his name was. Junhyuk shouted out his name, and Diso handed him a business card, asking him to contact him if he needed help. MC thanked him for this, and soon after, Junho approached him and asked him if he had said his name was Junhyuk. Junhyuk looked at Junho in surprise and asked what happened. Junho introduced himself to him, and Junhyuk replied that he knew him. After which, Junho held out his hand, and Junhyuk happily thought that he was walking into his hands, which meant he would make a copy. While Junhyuk respectfully shook Yunho's hand, he said that it was amazing. MC asked him again, to which Junho replied with a smile that he would never believe that he would see a national treasure in such a place. Diso, genuinely perplexed, began to ask him, is he calling his fan a national treasure? Junho suggested that this was not a lie. After which, he grabbed Dao by the neck and suggested that they stop talking because they needed to walk faster because the president of the association was waiting. Holding Diso close to him, Junho headed towards the association. Junhyuk silently watched them. Soon after, an irritated Jian followed them, complaining about what was happening. MC approached her and began to shout that he was also her fan, after which he asked if he could just shake her hand. Jian looked at him with disgust. Soon after, Junhyuk shouted that it would be a great honor for him. June stared at his palm. Soon after which, she demonstratively turned away and walked forward. Frustrated, Junhyuk, looking at her back, thought about how she had said earlier that she would give him an autograph and that it was strange. Frustrated, he decided to go to the side and then smilingly noticed that with the skills he had just copied, it was not even a jackpot, but a mega jackpot. At the same time, in New York, in the American Awakened Association, two men were looking at the monitor with their mouths wide open in surprise. One of the men asked what they were looking at now. They were watching the recording of Junhyuk's test in the association. One of the observers asked if this was even possible since after 3 hours, he had only spent 3% of his life force. Then he assumed that his name was Junhyuk, and the man asked what country he was from. His colleague answered that he was from Korea, after which the other asked him again, assuming that perhaps this was a scam. The guy pressing the phone to his ear answered his colleague that they had no need to do this, since people most likely don't even know that they're being watched. The man addressed the guy holding the phone to his ear as Paul and asked him to stop. Paul asked him again with displeasure, after which his colleague, named Kevin, suggested that he thought it was too early to inform their commanders since they should study a little more. Paul responded by asking Kevin if he knew how many awakened S ranks there were in the world at the moment. Without waiting for an answer, Paul stated that there were only 5 of them and that they all started out as C ranks. And because of this, both they and other countries were especially careful about those who had a C rank upon awakening. Kevin looked at him shortly after which, pressing the keys, Paul said that if they missed the time, they could miss the future S rank. When Paul dialed the number, he addressed his interlocutor as the director and said that he had just checked a tank from Korea who was registered as a C rank. At this time, Kevin, thoughtfully looking ahead, said future S rank. Paul continued to tell the commander that he was from Korea and they still needed to confirm something, but the result was simply incredible. A fragment from Junhyuk's fight was shown on the screen, after which the employee suggested that he thought they should take a look. Soon after these events, Junhyuk appeared from the teleport on the roof of a high-rise building and approached the door and thought that this was what he expected. He walked up the stairs and, looking at the system window, he realized that passive skills increased to the 3rd level, significantly increased defense and damage reduction. The system window said that the universal skill is passive and ideal defense is maximum. His defense increased by 3,000 units, and the damage received decreased by 50%. Also, his evasion increased by 20%, and health increased by 2.5000 units. In addition, the system window said that all elemental damage was reduced by 20. And since the skill is called unique, it can be added to the skill deck and used. Looking at this system window, Junhyuk realized that the added stats increased evasion, health, and decreased elemental damage. In the desert area, the red ferocious monster terrible roared. Diso, clad in armor, jumped to attack the monster. MC now understood that moreover such skills as shield stun and stun in position cause quite decent damage. Diso dealt a shield stun blow to the monster's face, pushing it back a little. MC realized that in times of crisis, this could serve as a trump card. A message appeared on the system window that the universal skill, which is active, that is the shield stun, is maximum and hits the opponent with a shield to stun him when the skill is activated, and it stuns for 5 seconds, thereby causing damage equal to 30,000, and the provocation damage is increased by 70%. Diso abruptly turned to Junhyuk and ordered him to act now. Junhyuk, clad in massive armor, was rapidly moving forward. MC understood that Junhyuk's unique skills did not have any stats that would increase the power of attacks. But the system window said that the universal skill, which is passive, is the master of speed at maximum level. Thanks to this skill, movement speed is increased by 300%, attack speed is increased by 300%, reaction speed is also increased by 300%, and visual acuity is increased by 150%. In addition, the skill increased accuracy by 50% and evasion by 25%, while wind damage was reduced by 50%. Junhyuk quickly approached the monster and then jumped incredibly high. MC understood that the flash skill was a jackpot. Finding himself behind the monster's head, Junhyuk concentratedly looked ahead and then delivered a sweeping blow. Junhyuk understood that after teleportation, the first attack deals 100% critical damage. With a painful expression on his face, the monster looked fiercely in front of him. On the system window, it was written that a universal skill called Flash, which is active and at maximum level, accelerates movement to confuse the opponent. Teleportation to any desired location within a radius of 100 m is also available, and the first attack after activating the skill guarantees critical damage. With a smile on his face, Junhyuk looked in front of him. Junhyuk also had a smile on his face. He walked up the stairs and happily realized that this was truly incredible luck. Entering the code, he thought that if he combines the skills that he copied from Diso and Junhyuk, then with his strength booster and weapon enhancement, he opened the doors, reasoning that in this case, perhaps he will be able to even fight alone with average monsters in the beginner's area. When he entered his apartment, he looked ahead with a tense expression and silently, soon after which he opened the cabinet and found unopened packages of food. Junhyuk touched the packages and realized that they were cold. He looked at the food and thought that he bought this for dinner, and in that case, why? At that moment, his sister suddenly came out of the room. MC looked at his sister in surprise, who tiredly asked him why he came so late. Junhyuk explained to her that he had something to do. After which Junhyuk asked his sister if she had eaten anything today. His sister replied in confusion that she thought it would be better if they all ate together. MC sat down to be on par with her and asked again, "Didn't he tell them to eat first?" Rubbing her eyes, her sister noticed that she knew this but didn't want to eat. MC looked at her carefully and asked why. Unjang threw herself into his arms, shouting that she dreamed that he would die. Junhyuk reacted with surprise to these words, after which Unjun continued to talk about how he also did not answer her calls, and she could not contact him and was very scared. The MC hugged his sister tightly and began to calm her down, asking who was going to die here. At that moment, Unchul appeared from the next room, who also wiped his eye and shouted, "Brother." With a pitiful expression on his face, Junhyuk's younger brother began to ask him why he came so late. Then Unchul shouted that they were waiting for him. At that moment, Junhyuk realized that he should have been more attentive. Soon after, Unchul, with a smile on his face, suggested that they eat chicken together. The MC thought about how he promised himself that he would treat the guys well upon returning. After which, he offered them food, but realized that he could not take care of them because he was so busy. When they sat down at the table, Junhyuk ordered himself to pull himself together, after which he assumed that this was why he came back. Late at night, when Unchul were fast asleep, Junhyuk stood by the table looking at the phone intently. He took a photo and discussed it soon, after which he went to the website saying that now he only needed to register the product and wait for a buyer to appear. Suddenly, he looked at the card in front of him in surprise and said that the blessing of the Chiron and the Mountain Rift were too valuable to just sell. He pressed his fingers to one of the cards and began the process of purchasing the Mountain Rift card. But the system window notified him that the skill could not be purchased because the user's class does not match the skill type, so it cannot be purchased. With a tense expression on his face, pressing his fingers to the card, Junhyuk asked if he could copy it then. However, now the system window informed him that the copying failed because the target is not awakened, so copying is impossible. With a thoughtful expression on his face, Junhyuk looked in front of him, realizing that he cannot copy either, so he probably has no options left. Suddenly, a message appeared on the system window that the creation of the personal core for the user of the original system was completed. With a painful expression, Junhyuk pressed his hands to his head and asked loudly, "What is this?" The system window began to report that the functional system of the core was generated, and he could check it in the status window. The next message from the system window said that the opening of the status system was in progress, and thanks to the creation of the core, it brought an additional 50 points, and a skill called Essence Absorption was generated, which is used to grow the core. The system window warned Junhyuk that he could check it in the skill window, and in addition, the information search function was unlocked, and he could see it in the command management window. MC loudly exclaimed painfully and then began to ask, "What kind of sound is this, and is this the creation of the core?" Suddenly, Junhyuk looked in front of him in surprise and saw that the system window said that the process of creating the core at this stage is 1%. MC thoughtfully asked himself, what kind of core creation? He realized that he had never heard of anything like this from Joel. Staring ahead, Junhyuk decided that he would understand when it was over. Soon after, he looked ahead in shock and clutched his head again. He saw the veins on his hands bulging and realized that his body was suddenly overflowing with power. With a surprised expression on his face, he looked at his palms, thinking that this was similar to the feeling when he first woke up. Soon after, his eyes began to glow a bright blue light, and he decided that he needed to find out. Sometime after these events, in a gloomy urban environment where high-rise buildings were destroyed and the roads were filled with deep cracks, a truck driven by Junhyuk was moving. The MC decided to open the information view soon after, and the system window asked him to enter keywords for the information he wanted to obtain. The MC said that the keyword was the original system, and the system window explained that the original system is divided into two parts: the master system, which is the power of creations, and the second system, which is the power of copies. Then, Junhyuk said the keywords master system and second system. Afterward, the system window revealed a message stating that the master system serves as the base for the derivative systems widespread throughout all dimensions and exists as a single entity, making it stand out among awakening-type systems. The MC got out of the truck while the system window continued to inform him that, unlike the master system, the second system, i.e., the copy master, requires a user to function, which applies to the awakening-type system. Junhyuk then said the keyword copy master, and the system window informed him that the copy master can copy all abilities obtained from the power of creation and can also combine the copied skills to create new ones. It copies targets, including all life forms affected by the derivative systems. Junhyuk, studying this information, thought that no matter how many times he heard it, it was still hard to understand. He asked himself again about all life forms, and assumed that this meant he could copy not only awakened individuals, but also monsters. At that moment, he climbed onto the roof of one of the buildings, where there were many concrete fragments. Heavy exhalation of air from his lungs made Junhyuk notice that he was in place. Soon after, he emptied a bottle of water and thought that this function of searching for information was very useful. He looked in front of him, reasoning that he unlocked such a thing only by generating a core. Afterward, he incredibly loudly shouted the order to open the status window. On the system window, where his status window was displayed, his name was written, indicating that this was his first awakening. His age of 25 and specialties, i.e., being a master of copies, were also indicated. Additionally, this system window indicated that this was the second version of the system, and his characteristics were as follows. Strength was 20, with another 100 points added. Endurance was 27 points, with another 100 points added. Speed was 35, with another 100 points added. Durability was 20, with 100 added. Agility was 14, with 100 added. The additional points were equal to 50. The attack power was 100, with the addition of 1,000. The defense power was also equal to 100, with the addition of 1,000. And the vitality was equal to 15,000, with the addition of 10,000. On the system window where the power was indicated, it was written that it was initially equal to 5,000, to which 7,000 and 20,000 were added, and it was restored by 1 per second. In the status window, it was also written that his core was at the first level, 0% experience, and the recharge points increased by 20,000, while the skill consumption was reduced by 10%, and the efficiency of the skills increased by 20%. Additionally, on the system window, it was written that the search for information was available in accordance with the class, and an increase in level was possible through the absorption of the core. Looking at this extensive description of his statuses, Junhyuk thought that there were also changes in his status window. He turned his attention to the characteristics and realized that characteristics had been added that were not there before. He paid attention to the option to add hundreds of points to all characteristics from the Twilight Bracelet that was also used, and decided that this was a huge increase in his skills. Then, he paid attention to the characteristics of the core and thought that if the recharge points mean what he thinks, then these determine the additional power that he can use when he exhausts the main one. After that, Junhyuk looked at the Twilight Bracelet and thought that with the bracelet, this could lead to incredible efficiency. And what is even more unexpected is that all these characteristics are at the first level, and with his training, most likely, these will increase. With a satisfied smile on his face, Junhyuk understood that, in addition, there's always a chance of new characteristics appearing. But suddenly, his reasoning was interrupted by a loud, frightening roar. The MC looked ahead with a surprised expression and then ran to the edge of the roof, where he could see a huge monster walking in the middle of the road. The MC suddenly used the map ability and, while studying the terrain layout, thought that, as expected, there was nothing alive nearby, and this was the perfect place for a test. Soon after these events, accompanied by a menacing roar, the monster walked along a deserted street. The MC stood in the middle of this street, right in front of the monster, thereby causing this creature to be surprised. The MC tightly clenched his fists, confidently looked ahead, and then used weapon enhancement. The system window asked him to choose a weapon type from the proposed ones: sword, dagger, spear, short spear, long bow, crossbow, mace, axe. The monster opened its mouth wide and began to roar menacingly, and then abruptly rushed to attack Junhyuk. Junhyuk decided to summon a long bow, and soon after, bright magical energy began to thicken in his hand. Smiling, Junhyuk looked at this, realizing that now he was beginning to understand why that guy, Park Kong-ho, was so strong. Looking at the rapidly approaching monster, Jun had put his bow in front of him and then fired a shot. A bright clot of magical energy hit the monster in the head. The MC gave commands, rapid fire, and critical shot. Clots of magical energy were rapidly directed towards the monster. Junhyuk understood that not only the core, but also everything else had grown to the maximum. Multiple projectiles synchronously flew into the head of the enraged monster, who began to scream frighteningly. After that, the monster suddenly staggered, and Junhyuk, catching this moment, began to approach forward, shouting, "Weapon enhancement." He jumped high into the air and ordered to switch to a long sword, after which another form began to thicken in his hand. With a smile on his face, Junhyuk understood that this meant that if he completely inherited Park Kong-ho's abilities, jumping high into the air and clutching a voluminous sword in his hand, Junhyuk assumed that this meant that he had become as strong as Park Kong-ho. With a sweeping motion of his hand, Junhyuk made a wide strike with a long sword. Soon after these events, many bright particles rose into the air from the body of the defeated monster. The MC, breathing heavily after the fight, looked at the screen of his phone and then said dissatisfiedly, 1 hour and 20 minutes. Frowning, Junhyuk realized that this was too slow and, considering that there were other monsters nearby, he needed to reduce the time to 30 minutes. Suddenly, the phone in his hand vibrated, and looking at the screen, Junhyuk discovered that he was receiving a call from the Awakened Association. He looked at the phone in surprise and asked, "Are they calling him at such a time?" Accepting the call and holding the phone to her ear, a girl named Kim Ji from the reception addressed him. Junhyuk answered her confusedly, after which Ji said that she called in case he was not sleeping. Then she asked him if it was convenient for him to talk. Junhyuk hesitantly confirmed this, explaining that he had something to do, after which he asked what it was. Ji informed him that they had received an unexpected message from the secretary's office. At that moment, another huge monster appeared behind Junhyuk and began to growl frighteningly. Ji continued to say that the president of the association wanted to meet him in person. The MC asked again, "The president today?" Ju confirmed this and asked Junhyuk what time would be convenient for him. In response, Junhyuk said that he would first like to know the president's working hours, to which Ji replied that he starts work at 7 a.m. In response, Junhyuk suggested setting up a meeting for 7 a.m. Ji asked him again in surprise, after which he noted that it was already 6:20 a.m. MC, concentratedly looking at the rapidly approaching, coring, formidable monster, said that he would be there in half an hour, and Ji confusedly agreed with this. When Junhyuk finished the call, he confidently looked at the monster who rushed to attack, waving his paws. Putting a shield in front of him, Junhyuk applied a stunning imposition. Shortly after, the monster staggered back. Taking advantage of the moment, Junhyuk began to rapidly approach, and, with brightly glowing eyes and putting a shield in front of him, he menacingly shouted, "Flash!" A cloud of bright energy began to rapidly move forward, and Junhyuk, in an instant, found himself behind the monster's head. Afterward, Junhyuk pressed his hand to the monster's skin, and the system window asked him if he wanted to copy the skill of a low-class soldier of the Bargo's job. Junhyuk abruptly jumped off the monster and answered the system window's question affirmatively. Shortly after, he landed on the asphalt, and the system window notified him that the copy was completed. After that, Junhyuk ordered the subspace to open, and the system window reported that a C-class core had been detected. MC stuck his hand inside this space, and then, taking the crystal in his hand, the system window asked him if he wanted to absorb it to raise his own core level. With a smile on his face, Junhyuk confirmed this, and the system window reported that the absorption of a C-class core had begun. After that, abundant energy began to surround Junhyuk's body. With a serious expression on his face, staring intently ahead, Junhyuk asked if he raised the core level, how much time would he be able to save? Soon after, the system window repeatedly notified Junhyuk that the core level had been raised. At this time, the monster was rapidly approaching Junhyuk, waving its paws. Sometime after these events, when a morning came near the skyscrapers, Junhyuk came out of the teleport and, taking the phone in his hand, said that at this rate, he could significantly reduce the time until his second awakening. Looking at the phone screen, he found that at the moment, the time was 5 minutes to 7 a.m. Suddenly, his stomach made a painful sound, pressing his hand to his stomach. Junhyuk guessed that he overdid it, and now he was dying of hunger. After a while, he and Ji were going up the elevator. He opened his system window and decided to check the details of the skill that he copied from Xeris. He found that the universal passive skill of the low-class soldiers of the Bargos race was copied, which increases attack power by 10% and increases defense by 10%, and low-class soldiers of the same race recognize it as one of their own. The universal skill must be registered in the skill column to use. Looking at this information, Junhyuk asked himself again, what does it mean that low-class soldiers of the same race recognize him as one of their own? The system window explained that it means that low-class soldiers of the Bargos race recognize him as one of their own and do not attack. However, this does not apply to high-class soldiers. MC assumed that this meant that these monsters would not attack him. Walking down the hallway behind Jahai, he realized that this was awesome, and he needed to activate it every time he went to fight alone. Ji opened the door to the office and then told Junhyuk that he could come inside. When he walked in, he saw a happy man who laughed and shouted that he was glad to meet him. Junhyuk confusedly agreed with this, and the association president pointed his finger at the chair and offered him to sit down. With a smile on his face, the association president turned to Junhyuk and asked him if he could address him informally. Worried, Junhyuk, with a nervous smile on his face, said that everything was fine. He knew that he was already speaking informally. The association president said that he had to admit that he was surprised to hear that he would come so early and that he was such a diligent young man. Junhyuk explained that it was because he had to make breakfast for his brother and sister, after which the association president asked him again, and Junhyuk replied that he also had to take them to a department store during the day to buy clothes. The room fell silent soon after, which the association president laughed loudly and said that he was more interesting than he expected, and the young people now have such a sense of humor that he can't really understand. However, Junhyuk thought that he was not joking. The association president, with a sly smile on his face, looked at Junhyuk intently and suggested that they skip the long speeches and get straight to the point. After that, he said that if we talk frankly, it's about the association. MC looked at him with interest, after which the association president said that they have one offer for him. After that, the association president asked Junhyuk if he could turn down the offer from the foreign guild and stay in Korea. Junhyuk looked at him carefully, after which he said that he didn't understand what he was talking about, and said that he hadn't received any offers from foreign guilds. The association president said that according to their sources, several of the largest guilds in the United States are showing interest in recruiting him. MC asked again, guild from the United States? The association president admitted that he was embarrassed to say this, but believed that their test data had been hacked, and they suspected that they had become interested in him after watching the stolen test footage. MC assumed that there had been some misunderstanding, after which he asked if they even knew what class he was. The association president confirmed this, after which Junhyuk asked if even the largest guild in the United States was taking action. Junhyuk then began to ask if C-Class was really that impressive. Junhyuk noted that he was still only a person who had awakened once. With a smile on his face, the association president asked him if he knew the class of most people who had awakened for the second time. The association president then explained that it was C-Class. And to be honest, with the exception of some differences in characteristics, it could be put on par with most people who had awakened for the second time. As he said this, the association president spread his arms wide in different directions. MC stared at him intently and silently, after which the association president continued to talk about him, imagining that he would be able to increase his stats to the maximum in his second awakening, and then he would be able to instantly reach Class A. MC thought about this, meaning that just a second awakening would make him capable of being on par with someone who had awakened for the third time, and there was even a possibility of reaching Class S. The association president began to talk about how, based on his tanking abilities, the association believed that even without reaching Class S, he was already highly valued. At that moment, Ji approached Junhyuk and handed him a tablet, while the association president continued to talk about how they couldn't afford to let him go. So their proposal would be as follows. Taking another tablet in his hands, the association president began to talk about how he was being offered an initial payment of 1 billion won and a complete exemption from taxes for his team. Junhyuk frowned as he carefully studied the contract, while the association president explained that 2 pieces of Class A equipment would also be provided to him for free. Studying the statement, Junhyuk thought that this was too generous an offer for some C-class. The president of the association, handing over a writing pen to Junhyuk, said that the contract would be valid until his second awakening. The president of the association assumed that this was a good deal and then explained to him that if he signed the document, it would all belong to him. MC did not answer, and then, looking closely at his interlocutor, noticed that he listened to their proposal but did not quite understand. Then Junhyuk asked, "Is all this support just so that he would stay in Korea, or are there any other conditions?" The president of the association abruptly pressed his hand to himself and noticed that he could not be deceived. Afterward, the president stood up and confirmed Junhyuk's question by stating that the association had other conditions. He could not accept citizenship from another country during the contract, nor could he join any guilds. For missions abroad, he would have to consult with the association. Sitting on the table, the president added that if the association made a request for a raid, Junhyuk was obliged to do it first. Junhyuk noted that this meant no one could stand between him and the association. The president replied that if Junhyuk joined a guild, then when considering any requests, the decision would be up to the guild, and their goals would take priority over his. With these words, the association president explained why such conditions were set. Afterward, Junhyuk asked the association president if there were any other binding points besides those mentioned. The association president explained that there was nothing else, but emphasized that he could not give Junhyuk too much time to think about it, because the offer was only valid until the Americans contacted him. Junhyuk abruptly snatched the contract and said that he understood everything. The association president began to watch his actions in bewilderment. Junhyuk explained that there was no reason to delay and sign the document. With a surprised smile on his face, the association president asked if Junhyuk didn't need time to think about all this. Stretching out his hand toward the president, Junhyuk said that he did not need more time. They shook hands, and the association president said that he liked Junhyuk's determination. Sometime after these events, in a busy downtown shopping mall, Junhyuk and his younger brother and sister were standing in the main hall. Unchul was shouting happily, thrilled that they were in a department store. The children looked around with surprised expressions on their faces. Then Unchul pointed at the men's clothing section and asked his brother if he could look around there. Unjong asked Unchul not to make noise because otherwise they would get scolded. However, Junhyuk encouraged them to stop just looking and advised them to choose something they liked. Unjong asked him again, with a surprised expression, if she could really take whatever she wanted. Unkali asked if he could only choose 2 of each item. With a smile on his face, Junhyuk explained that they could take not only 2, but even 10 if they wanted, so he advised them to take whatever they liked. Unjang and Unchul were very happy about this and started having fun, shouting that they would take everything. Looking at the children looking through the items, Junhyuk thought that things had been turning out unexpectedly lately, and he was worried about the future difficulties that would come. With a smile on his face, he was thinking about what would happen once the rookie protection period ended. Suddenly, Unjung, who was showing off a dress, asked her brother, "What about this?" Unchul advised her to take it because it was very beautiful. Jungha continued to think that joining the association was not burdensome, and the only mandatory point was a ban on moving to other countries and joining guilds. Everything else was just recommendations. So this was a good deal overall. Suddenly, a female consultant approached Yunjang and told her that they were not allowed to touch the clothes on display. Upset, Junhyuk immediately apologized to the girl, understanding that on top of everything else, he had a whole list of tasks that he definitely had to complete. Junhyuk approached the sales assistant and asked her not to worry about it, because he would buy everything they touched. The sales assistant asked him in surprise and then agreed. With a smile on his face, Junhyuk continued to think that until he completed all the things on this list, he still had no reason to leave for Korea. Suddenly, they heard a loud announcement, and the announcer's voice addressed the customers, saying that a sudden gate had appeared next to the department store. The announcer's voice repeated the announcement, and there was commotion all around. Junhyuk asked himself about the situation near the department store. The announcer asked the customers to remain calm and follow the staff's instructions. At that moment, the sales assistant came out of the store and addressed the customers of the department store, saying that the hunters from Tibet would be arriving soon. She asked everyone to wait inside the department store until further instructions. The visitors started asking her what she was talking about and whether they shouldn't evacuate immediately. The consulted girl shouted that it was much more dangerous to go outside now and that she would take them to a safe zone. So she asked them to follow her. Suddenly, one of the men pushed the girl forward and ordered them to act faster and get out of his way because he had to get his safety first. The girl was thrown aside with a painful scream, and chaos filled the space of the department store. Children screamed for their parents, and the employees tried to convince the rowdy customers not to push and remain calm. At this time, Junhyuk, with a stern expression on his face, looked menacingly ahead. He turned to the female consultant and asked her if she could take his brother and sister to a shelter. The female consultant looked at him in surprise and began to ask him again. Afterward, Junhyuk stated that he was a hunter and would go check out the situation outside. So he again asked her to take the children to a safe place. In genuine bewilderment, with her eyes and mouth wide open, the girl asked him again. Unjang grabbed Junhyuk by his clothes and, with a worried expression, asked if he really needed to go. Then she noticed that they were told not to go outside because it was dangerous. At this time, Junhyuk realized that the real danger was the department store. If he remembered correctly, there were 5D-class monsters nearby. Junhyuk remembered that on that day, monsters were chasing people who were hiding in a department store in his past life. The city newspapers wrote that monsters had entered the Central University and there were many victims. Junhyuk remembered that as a result of this incident, the building collapsed, and then he had no reason to go to the department store, so he treated it as someone else's story. Tightly clenching his fists from tension, Junhyuk asked himself, who would have thought that this would happen today? Then Junhyuk turned to his sister and asked her to take care of her brother. Yin wanted to say something to him, but Junhyuk thought that if he was here alone, he would not slow down, but there was no guarantee that he would be able to get out safely with his brother and sister. Junhyuk walked in the opposite direction, leaving the consultant girl with his brother and sister. Unchul, holding out his hand towards his brother as he left, loudly shouted that he also wanted to go with him and asked him to take him. With a menacing expression, Junhyuk walked away, thinking that the Taebik Guild would not arrive until the building was completely destroyed. So he only had one option until that guild arrived. With a tense expression, he realized that he had to stand firm.